Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Airbus, what's it doing now? We're going to take a look today at an in-service event concerning a fuel leak. In this case, it was an engine fuel leak. It was quite interesting because I've had a few questions from people concerning the fuel leak QRH and the procedure concerning the management of a fuel leak in the event of a fuel leak from the engine and a fuel leak from a tank, and the validity of continuing to run the engine in the event that it's identified as a wing tank leak, for example. In the event you've had a tyre burst or something, you've identified that it's actually a tank leak. The cabin crew have gone out and had a look at the overwing, and they can see fuel spilling out of that part of the wing. Not an engine leak identified by low N1 or high fuel flow, etc. And the crew have quickly identified that it is a wing leak. The validity of continuing to run the engine, as the QRH asks you to turn the engine off and then consider turning it on again once you've identified it as that. And it created quite a discussion, and I was thinking about sort of various options and then putting a video together. And then I was reading the Airbus safety magazine, and an article in there, the latest article, concerns an event on a 330 that had a fuel leak, but in this case it was from the engine, so different from the fuel leak scenario of a wing tank. And this particular crew elected to keep the engine running, which is contradictory to the QRH. So I thought it would be quite useful, as we had a lot of questions about fuel management of fuel leaks. And some questions come up, such as, why do we not use reversers in the event of a fuel leak, etc. And this article covers that question and some of the others that had been asked. So I thought it would actually be very useful to do the two things together, have a look at this in-service event, and it will answer some of the questions concerning the fuel leak QRH. Now, this case study involves an A330, which is slightly different to the 320, which we'll come on to in a little while. And it's a fuel leak caused by the incorrect assembly of a primary fuel hose. Now, I don't know how that came about. The article doesn't go into that detail of whether it was due to an engine change or some scheduled maintenance, but and there has been a mod, I think, which I'll talk about later on, but the fuel hose wasn't connected correctly. The fuel leak was estimated to be approximately 45 litres per minute, or when you calculate the maths out in the specific gravity of fuel, about 2 tons per hour, which is, extraordinary, really. As I mentioned, there are some differences with the 330. With the 330 having the fuel trim transfer system that takes fuel from the fuller tank to help manage the CFG, and which actually, interestingly, in this article, when we read through it, was one of the things that masked what would have normally been an imbalance, because the trim system actually balanced the fuel up, so it wasn't immediately evident at that point. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, this was a leak from the engine where the crew elected not to shut down the engine as directed by the QRH. So it does remind us of the difference between the engine and suspected tank leaks, and a reminder of the QRH procedure. Now, like I say, in all of these things, we're not assessing the crew who are making judgment. It's the fact that they share this information to us raises questions, and it makes us better pilots at the end of it, by asking these questions and see why it is that the crew were led down this particular path, and then we can all learn from it. But it's also a reminder of why if an engine leak is suspected, that if the engine is not shut down, what the risks are associated with keeping it running. Okay, that is a really important take home here, and the clear differences between the fuel tank leak, where you can restart the engine after you've identified that the fuel is still leaking after the shutdown, or an engine fuel leak, where you identified it as such that if the leak stops after you've shut down the engine, you keep that engine off. And the article explains why we do that. And lastly, why we don't use reverse thrust when we have a suspected engine leak. So, or when we have a suspected fuel leak. So I was going to go through this. For those of you that have been with the channel a little while now, this is the safety corner part of the channel. And excuse me, the way I do this is I read through, and these articles are available to anybody. You don't need to be a member of this channel to see this. This is widely available, and you can read it yourself. I just add a little bit of context to some of the things and emphasize certain areas so that the points that I think need bringing out. And so I'll be reading it from the actual report itself, adding a few bits and pieces, plus along with the video, adding some diagrams as well from the text, just help explain the point. So let's start with the fuel management in flight. A fuel leak can have serious consequences, especially because of the risk of fire and fuel starvation. When a fuel leak is detected, it's essential to follow the operational procedures to maintain the safety of the flight. Now, when it talks about fire, of course, you've got fuel leaking around, hot parts of the engine potentially. And there's obviously a significant fire risk, which is one of the reasons why we shut an engine down if we believe that it is a leak from the engine. Now, the article highlights how to detect and confirm a fuel leak on the 300, 600 series, 310, 320, 30, 40, 50, and 80 aircraft. Now, there are some slight differences there, but essentially the QRH is very, very similar. It also records which actions to perform, especially shutting down the engine in the case of an engine fuel leak to prevent any risk of engine fire. Fuel leak management for the 220 will be addressed in a future article. I don't know much about the A220 at all, and it's not covered in this article as far as I can see. Now, the case study. Event description. An A330 aircraft was reaching its cruise flight level during a night flight. What happens at night? It was 35 minutes after takeoff, so TA plus 35, and the flight crew performed its first fuel check, so presumably it's the top of its initial climb fuel check. The initial fuel quantity after refueling block fuel was 45.6 tons, 45,600 kilos. So again, this emphasises the point of doing fuel checks along your route, how your company asks you to do that, what's in your ops manual. Obviously, it may change from company to company, but this emphasises the importance of fuel checks. Now, the first fuel check showed the fuel on board value of 37,680 with an indicated fuel use quantity of 6,480. Don't worry about the numbers so much in a minute because it does the calculations for you here. The sum represented a discrepancy of 1,440, so 1.4 tons already after about 35 minutes of flight time. Now, a non-significant lateral fuel imbalance between the two at the tanks of 90 kilos was displayed. The captain attributed the 1.4 ton fuel quantity discrepancy to the ongoing fuel transfers from the inner wing tanks to the trim tank and suggested monitoring the evolution of the fuel quantity. Now, I don't really know how that fuel trim works and the indications you get on a 330 about how much fuel is in that trim tank. It shows here in figure 1 that it does display what's in the trim tank. So in my mind, if you add up all that fuel together and you're 1.4 tons light, then you're 1.4 tons light. But I think what's happened here, and it explains later on in the article, that because there wasn't any real significant imbalance, I mean, what is it, 90 kilos is nothing really, is it? We see that a lot, don't we? Particularly if you've been burning the APU for a little while, etc. So yeah, and if you have a discrepancy of 100 kilos, it's not going to be the end of the world. But yeah, 1.4 tons is. But because the trim tanks are in operation here, as I mentioned earlier on, it will take it from the higher tank. So actually, bar the discrepancy of 1.4 tons, there wasn't the asymmetry in the fuel tanks to alert you to a fuel leak. Okay. 30 minutes later, that's takeoff time plus an hour and 5 minutes, the flight crew noticed that 2.670 of fuel was missing, with an imbalance now of 780 kilograms, indicating a possible fuel leak on the left side. So this fuel trim is still happening, but of course the fuel is leaking faster than the trim is able to sort of, I say, keep up in terms of maintaining the balance. So now we've got 2.6 tons missing and an imbalance of 780 kilos. So I guess the crew are now getting quite concerned. And you can see that in figure 2 here. Now the flight crew initiated the fuel leak QRH. They maintain the crossfeed valve closed, as it suggests, set the left center tank and the right center tank push button switches to off, again following the QRH. I might actually pull the QRH up on the side here for you so you can follow it through. And then set the T tank, the transfer tank selector, to ISOL, which I think stops the fuel transfer, which would make sense. I don't know that. I'm not a 330 operator. If you are, please put the comments below. But I think that's what that does, because later on it did lead to an almost out of trim situation. The procedure then requests that the flight crew monitor the fuel depletion rate of each unit tank. So all they've done here is they've isolated the tanks to see there's no crossfeed, there's no fuel going anywhere, and they can see then what's actually going on. That's the idea behind that, and that's what the QRH is asking you to do, to try and identify what's happening. Excuse me, it still hurts when I cough. I told you in the last video I had a motorcycle accident. I broke a bunch of ribs. Well, the last CT scan, I won't go on, the last CT scan actually showed there were more ribs broken than before. The lungs healed, but I kid you not, it's the most painful thing you'll ever get. I've fallen off lots of motorbikes and broken stuff, but ribs, I cannot begin to tell you how painful it is. Let's get back to it then. So 26 minutes later, this is takeoff plus an hour and 31 minutes. 3.5 tons of fuel was missing, and there was an imbalance now of 1.7. 990 kilos in 26 minutes. Oh, that's a lot between the two inner tanks. Given the significant fuel imbalance, the fuel leak QRH procedure requests that the affected engine be shut down. The flight crew initiated diversion and decided to keep the left engine running. So that's a critical part there. Now, if you had a fuel imbalance, look at the fuel imbalance QRH, it tells you to make sure there's no fuel leak before you do this. All right, so they're in the right part of the checklist here because they've discovered that this is a fuel leak. They didn't have the imbalance initially because the trim was taking that fuel out and masking the imbalance. But now, obviously, we have the fuel leak QRH procedure requests that the affected engine be shut down. The flight crew initiated diversion, but decided to keep that left engine running. So I think they froze the checklist really at that point, keeping the pumps off and keeping the isolator on, which stopped the fuel from going out to the to trim the aircraft up. Now, 4 minutes later, this is takeoff plus 135. The fuel on board disagree ECAM alert, referring to the fuel leak QRH procedure, which the flight crew had initiated some 30 minutes previously and stopped when the request was to shut down the affected engine. Now, both engines were kept running. One maintenance technician who was present on board the aircraft visually confirmed that the fuel leak was from the left engine. So they could see it from the engine, from the pylon, but you've got a maintenance technician on there also that's had a look out the wing and can see that it's actually coming from. I'm assuming that's what he's done, or whether they brought him into the flight deck and showed them the presentations they had on the ECAM. Now, we'll talk later on about the ECAM message you get on the CEO and the NEO in terms of fuel imbalance and fuel leak. Okay. So just to recap here, halfway through the QRH, got to the point where it says shut it down. They kept the engine running. Fuel on board disagree ECAM came up, and that then drove them towards the fuel leak QRH, which they'd already done some 30 minutes ago. So it's a bit alarming, actually. You've got to lose that much fuel before it actually comes up and notifies you about it. And it's actually the fuel checks here that save the guys, really, because they were alerted to this 30 minutes before the aircraft actually told them about it. So big thumbs up there, I suppose. So 30 minutes later, 2 hours and 5 minutes, the fuel imbalance advisory triggered. The fuel quantity values of both the inner and the outer tanks were flashing. Due to the imbalance of more than 3 tons, the QRH associated with this advisory requires that the crew consider that the imbalance may be due to a fuel leak, and in this case, It redirects the fuel leak QRH procedure. Again, both engines were kept running. So they had the ECAM, imbalance, could be due to a fuel leak. They'd already completed their part of the procedure. 2 hours and 20 minutes later, the aircraft landed with 5.2 tons of fuel missing and a 3.5 ton imbalance. Thrust reversers were not used in accordance with the fuel leak QRH. The flight crew decided to keep the left engine on to ease a 180 turn around maneuver at the end of the runway. They shut down the left engine after the turnaround and shut the right engine when they reached the parking area. So they did shut down the left engine after the turn, the 180 turn on the runway, and then close the other engine down. Now, it might have been that they thought, well, look, if it's coming out of the engine, maybe they didn't think there was nothing they could do about it. Just keep running it. It's going to run out of fuel at some point, and they can shut it down when they feel that they don't need it anymore. But we'll come on to why the QRH instructs you to shut that engine down when you've identified it as a fuel leak from the engine. So the event analysis, incorrect assembly of the primary fuel hose as the root cause of the problem. And there's a picture here that shows where that is, just at the top part of the engine, underneath what looks like the pre-cooler there. Actually, it is. Yeah, it's the pylon there where the pre-cooler is. So examination of the engine showed that the fuel leak was located downstream of the LP valve at the interface between the left pylon and the left engine. Now, the primary fuel hose, which brings fuel from the pylon to the engine, was not correctly installed. Its mounting flange that connects it to the pylon was not correctly aligned. Vibrations caused the flange to move and created the leak. There you go. A lot of fuel coming out of there. Now, prevention of incorrect primary fuel hose installation on 330 aircraft with a CF6 engine. There's an AMM here. I'm not going to read this out here. Provides specific recommendations to prevent any incorrect installation of the associated risk of assembly distortion. Okay, so there's an AMM there, task which the engineers would have to follow, presumably. Now, the constant fuel leak recorded data analysis shows that the fuel leak from engine 1 was present from the start of the flight at a constant rate of about 45 litres per minute, equivalent to 2 tons per hour. So was that during taxi? Did that fuel just pour into the engine cowling and then start leaking as they took off? I don't know, but that's a lot. That's a lot. Or do they mean after takeoff? I don't know. So it's really important for the ground crew, and don't disconnect the ground crew until both engines have absolutely started and you're happy before letting them go. It gives them the opportunity then to watch the engines as you're doing it. Excuse me. The aft transfer starts around flight level 255. If the fuel quantity between the two inner tanks differs by more than 500 kilos, the aft transfer is done from the heavier tank to the trim tank until the balance is restored or the trim tank becomes full. All right, so that was why it masked the fuel imbalance, because at some point it was 500 kilos more and it started pouring it into the trim tank, which was not full at the time. It explains why the imbalance was limited to 90 kilos during the first fuel check performed at the beginning of the cruise phase. Shutting down the engine is necessary to confirm the left engine leak. Well, it asks you to do that in both cases, doesn't it, then, to identify where the leak's coming from. Now, the flight crew started to apply the leak identification step of the fuel leak QRH procedure by making sure that the crossfeed valve was closed, absolutely correct, and the left sensor, right sensing push buttons were off, and setting the T-tank feed to ISOL. Now, a little more than 20 minutes later, the imbalance increased by 990 from 780 to 1.7 tons, confirming the presence of a leak on the left side. Now, the next step of the procedure requires that the flight crew shut the left engine or shut the engine down to determine if the leak comes from the engine or from the left wing. Now, of course, there's other indications that would notify you or lead you towards an engine leak, such as a low N1 or high fuel flow, depends on whether it's on or before the metering valve, for example. We've covered that in engines. However, the flight crew stopped applying the procedure at this stage and maintained the left engine on, which continued to feed the fuel leak until the end of the flight. In fact, until they shut it down after that 180-degree turn. high risk of engine fire, and this is why it's really important to shut the engine down. Keeping the left engine running maintain a high risk of fire since the fuel is leaking to hot parts of the engine. Now, excuse me, you might argue, I don't know how much air actually of the bypass actually goes around that part of the engine to keep it cool, but you've still got a lot of fuel there, however many litres a minute we said it was. 2 tons an hour leaking to that engine. There's a very high chance that it could reach hot parts of the engine, but especially when you're on the ground there after landing, when there's no relative forward airflow, it's going to be pouring into those parts. So yeah, there's an obvious reason there as to why. We know that we should do as part of the QRH, but this is why. Keeping the engine running until the 180 degree turn on the runway created fuel diffusion in the atmosphere during the remainder of the flight and contamination of the runway. Okay, so there's an environmental problem there, and you're going to have the fire service out decontaminating the runway of fuel, which is obviously going to close the runway for a bit of time. That's just obviously the add-ons, really, as the reasons as to why we need to shut it down. Excessive RC of G due to left tank isolated. Trim tank, left isolated. Too many lefts in there. So the flight crew interrupted their application of the fuel leak QRH procedure at the leak identification step, hence they kept the engine running. Therefore, the fuel tank remained isolated. Okay, so they didn't complete the procedure, basically. Especially with no possible fuel transfer from the trim tank, the aircraft CFG increased further aft throughout the flight and reached 39.8% at landing, only just below the threshold of 40.5 for a gross weight of 174 tons, which is the trigger for the fuel excess aft CFG red ECAM alert. Yeah, so by closing that valve, well, by not completing the procedure, leaving those pumps off and leaving the ISO off, it meant that the fuel transfer wasn't able to be completed or to work correctly, which left them with a significant aft CFG. Regular fuel checks, alerting indicators that could signal a fuel leak. Indicators of a possible fuel leak are abnormal decrease in fuel tank quantity or the total fuel. That's either out of one wing caused by an imbalance, masked in this case, or the total fuel. So your fuel on board, fuel used, doesn't match the fuel at departure, then there's going to be a problem. I think on the 350 it has a calculation: fuel on board plus fuel used minus block. And so there'll be and if there's a big minus figure there, then there's obviously a problem, and you would then monitor that during the cruise. So regular fuel checks, obviously very important. Now, a light fuel imbalance can exist at the start of a flight due to APU that is fed only from one side and a single engine taxi operation. Now, we discussed this earlier on, and in fact, we did a live event, if I remember rightly, concerning something like this with a fuel imbalance. But it's very possible with long taxi, single engine taxi, and APU burning to actually have quite a lot of fuel out of one side. And have a slight imbalance, okay? And that's one part of your brief before you leave. Regular fuel checks should be performed during the cruise. The standard operating procedures for the 300, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and 80 aircraft recommend the flight crew perform regular fuel checks during the cruise. A check should be done when overflying a waypoint or at least every 30 minutes. That's the Airbus recommendation. So check one, fuel on board plus fuel used minus block fuel. And I think that is on the 350. Those regular checks consist of comparing the sum of the current fuel on board and the fuel used with the fuel on board at the start of the flight, the block fuel. If this sum is much less and is continually decreasing, then of course it's going somewhere where it shouldn't, and into the atmosphere by some method, either by a leak in the tank or pouring out the engine. On the 350, the fuel on board plus fuel used minus block information is displayed on the cruise SD page. That's really useful. And on the fuel SD page to help detect any anomaly more easily, and increasing negative value could indicate a fuel leak. Okay, so actually they have that on the cruise page and on the fuel page, which is very useful. I don't think that eliminates the need to carry out regular manual fuel checks. But I think there's an extra source of information there for the crew to doubly check that the computer's operating correctly. Fuel on board versus the FMS fuel prediction. Now, another check is to compare the fuel on board and the fuel predictions from the FMS with the estimated fuel on board per waypoint from the computerized flight plan, the OFP, or CFP as they call it, or any EFB performance calculation used. Any growing discrepancy can indicate be an indication of a fuel leak. Now, of course, that's fine when everything's operating, but there are certain things where the FMS fuel predictions can't be relied upon, but that's something else. But all things being equal, comparing against the FMS predicted fuel on board is also another useful way of determining if you have correct fuel management. Now, further information on fuel monitoring is available in the Safety First article, Fuel Monitoring on the 320 Family Aircraft. So we might take a look at that on another episode. The automatic fuel leak detection, some of the ECAMs that you might see, performing manual checks enables a flight crew to detect a fuel leak as soon as possible. However, following an event on an A330 aircraft which resulted in fuel exhaustion and landing with empty fuel tanks, ECAM alerts were introduced as an additional safety net to help flight crew detect a fuel leak and make sure necessary actions are performed in a timely manner. That was the glider, wasn't it? It was called the 330 that landed somewhere in the Azores, if I remember rightly. And there was a confusion over, or a mistake made between kilos and pounds. I'm not going to say any more than that because I can't remember the full facts. But essentially led to fuel exhaustion and landing. I think the captain was a very experienced glider pilot. Got more experience that day, of course. Fuel system leak detection upstream of the fuel metering valve, which is something I alluded to earlier on. 320 aircraft, 30, 40, 50 and 80 aircraft, the consistency check between fuel on board and fuel used and block fuel is automatically computed and triggers an ECAM alert when the difference reaches a specific threshold. Now, what we will see on the 320, now this is, I believe this is on the NEOs, fuel used versus fuel on board disagree. As well, I think, as imbalance. I just have to have a quick look at my docunet on that one. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that concerns. I won't go into it now. I'm pretty sure that concerns the A320 Neo, but you can look that up in your FCOM. So fuel used versus fuel on board disagree on the 320 aircraft. 350 and 380 fuel leak suspected and fuel leak detected on the 380, so that's slightly further advanced. The alerts requested the application of the fuel leak procedure, so it directs you basically to the QRH. Best practice, the ECAM alerts are available on some aircraft and indicating a possible fuel leak are just additional safety nets. Performing regular manual fuel checks is the best practice to ensure early detection of fuel leak before triggering such alerts. As this crew found out that they had gone into the QRH procedure some 30 minutes before the aircraft alerted to them. So really these are backup ECAMs, okay, and shouldn't really be relied upon. Engine fuel detection downstream of the fuel metering valve. The NEO has the engine fuel leak, as well as the 330 and 340. The 350 and 380 leak suspected or leak detected. So I was saying earlier on about the other ECAM you get. It will be engine fuel leak on the NEO, and it will be fuel used, fuel on board disagree on the 320 NEO again, I believe. Okay, so that's what we would probably see, or once the aircraft picks it up. But the idea is that we pick it up on a manual fuel check before these, as they're a bit of a belt and braces last backup. Key point, following an engine fuel leak alert, the flight crew must confirm the fuel leak by checking the fuel parameters, fuel aboard, fuel used, fuel flow and imbalance, and N1 parameters. If the leak is confirmed, the affected engine must be shut down. That's the big take home here, okay? We're not talking about wing leaks where you can restart the engine, you may as well just run it. We're talking about an engine leak here, this particular case, okay? And with an engine leak, it must be shut down. The fuel leak automatic detection detects potential leaks downstream of the fuel metering valve. Right, fuel leak handling, significant risks. A fuel leak is a serious event that requires immediate attention due to the risk of fire. Fuel spillage on hot components such as the engines or brakes can start a fire. Well, absolutely. I suppose initially I was thinking, obviously, fuel into the hot parts of the engine obviously can cause a fire. But also we have to think about fuel going onto the hot brakes, which is another reason why we don't use reverse thrust. We don't want that fuel leak blowing around everywhere. Excuse me. My son trying to ring me, but I can't talk to him now. Fuel spillage on hot components, such as the engine or brakes, can start a fire. There's a risk of fuel starvation. Excessive loss of fuel may lead to a low fuel situation, and ultimately may cause a flame out of the engine. Well, if there's no fuel going in it, it will be starved of fuel and it will stop. The risk of environmental contamination we spoke about earlier on. Fuel leak can lead to environmental contamination on the ground. Contaminating the runway and taxiway with fuel may impair the operations of other aircraft. To prevent these risks, when the fuel leak is confirmed, it is essential to apply the fuel leak procedure to identify the source and contain the leak. Now, we're going to take a look now at the fuel leak procedure, and I'm going to take a break there now because I'm going to ring my son back, make sure he's not lying in a ditch somewhere, because that would be remiss of me. And then we're going to take a look at the actual procedure. There's some really good diagrams here which go through it step by step and just remind us of that procedure and why we're doing what we're doing in identifying engine or wing leaks. Okay, right, back to have a look at this fuel leak, consider landing. That was just my son. He wasn't lying there in a ditch or anything. He had an interview today with a Formula student as he's doing sports science, wants to get into motorsport, and he's getting into the business side of a Formula team at the university, and he thought it went very well. Anyway, let's get back to what we were talking about: fuel leak and consider landing. Now, as soon as a fuel leak is confirmed, the flight crew must consider landing at the nearest suitable airport. And when you look at the QRH or EQRH, right at the top there, it says land ASAP in amber. Okay, so we want to start looking at a diversion. Now, step one, is there an obvious leak from the engine or an engine pylon? Now, the first step of the fuel leak procedure, and it's consistent across nearly all the aircraft, is to consider an engine fuel leak as the most common cause of the leak. Airbus believe if you're going to get a fuel leak, the likely cause is going to be from the engine. Now, the indicators confirm that an engine leak, that it may be an engine fuel leak, are fuel spray directly visible from the engine pylon. That might have been what the engineer had seen. N1 indication significantly decreasing on one side, and because it can't get the fuel, and excessive fuel flow on one side. Now, if an engine leak is confirmed, the affected engine must be shut down to avoid any fire risk and to help contain the leak. Now, when an engine fuel leak is confirmed, there is a high risk of fire. The affected engine must be shut down and must not be restarted for the remainder of the flight, and that's what it says in the QRH. Now, we're looking at this little flow diagram here. The fuel leak suspected during a fuel check and the application of the fuel leak procedure. Now, in this case, they're looking at the fuel used and the fuel on board versus the departure fuel was negative 520 kilos. If there is an obvious leak from the engine or from a pylon, you've either got a low N1, excessive fuel flow, or fuel spray is visible. If none of those are relevant, then we go to step two, which we'll talk about just in a moment. If any one of those criteria is relevant, then we shut down the affected engine. The thrust lever goes to idle on the affected engine. We turn the switch off the engine on the engine master, and then you can cross feed as required, assuming, of course, that the fuel has stopped leaking at that point. That's the first step of the fuel leak procedure. Now, step two, the isolation of the fuel tanks and fuel quantity monitoring. So, assuming that you don't have the N1 or excessive fuel flow or fuel spraying out of the engine area or the pylon, if an engine fuel leak is not directly confirmed, the next step of the fuel leak procedure is to stop all the fuel transfers, isolate each tank in order to locate the source of it. Is it coming from the inner or the outer wings, etc. By doing so, each engine will be supplied by its own associated wing tank. Okay, it'll be separated the system. Now you see here, to prevent any fuel transfer from the center tank, the left and right transfer off, or center tank pumps 1 and 2 off. That's whether you're operating on CEO or the Neo, and maintain the cross feed closed. Now we monitor, as it's highlighted in these yellow circles here, the depletion rate of each engine's tank. Is there an asymmetry in depletion between each tank? Well, if no, center tank pump or the APU feed line may be suspected. Go straight to step 3B. So it's not coming from an engine. It doesn't seem to be a leak from each tank because they don't seem to be depleting one faster than the other. Then we can suspect it's probably maybe a center tank or maybe even the APU feed line. If, however, there is a depleting, it's engine or wing leak suspected, apply step 3A. It sounds a little bit confusing here, but I'll bring the step up, and of course we've the pictures up, and we've also got the fuel leak QRH here. So confirmation of engine leak or of a wing leak. Set the thrust lever to idle. So in both cases here, we're going to be turning the engine off in order to see if the wing depletes any further. So set the thrust lever of the affected side to idle, turn the start switch off, and then monitor the quantity of the corresponding tank. Has the leak stopped? Yes, it has. Then it's an engine leak is confirmed. If not, then a wing leak is suspected. Consider restarting the engine. If the engine leak is confirmed, then keep the affected engine off. Okay. If not, then we can consider restarting the engine and enable the fuel transfer back on. So confirmation step in the case of a suspected engine or wing leak on a 320 aircraft, which is what we've just run through there. Okay. So the first thing to do is to identify that there's a possible leak, either by an imbalance or less fuel on one side. It could be excessive fuel flow, it could be excessive or low N1, or it could be visible spray. If you do have one of those symptoms, then you just shut the engine down. Okay. If not, then we go straight to step 2. Then the step 2 is about isolating each fuel tank and monitoring the fuel quantities by turning the transfer tanks off, having a look. If one depletes further than the other, we can suspect engine or wing leak. If they don't, then we can suspect it's a center tank. What we go ahead then do is shut an engine down, see if it stops. If it does, keep it off. If after the shutting the engine down, then it doesn't stop leaking, then we can consider restarting the engine. Okay, so 2 different cases there. Okay, when we shut that engine off, if we see that the fuel stops leaking, then we keep that engine off and we consider it still an engine leak. If we turn that engine off and the fuel still leaks, then we can consider that the likely cause there, the least possible scenario, the least likely case as far as Airbus is concerned, as a wing leak. Then you can consider restarting that engine. And then the transfer valves go on the non-leaky side, if you like, to make sure that that engine has its correct and full supply of fuel. You have to remember, of course, excuse me, that if you have restarted that engine, as you suspect it's a wing leak, then that fuel is, then that side is shut off, of course, because the crossfeed stays closed. Excuse me. That fuel is going to go, and that engine will be starved of fuel. So you're going to have to think at some point, you're going to have to go through the shutdown procedure and decide when you're going to do that. The nice thing about having the engine running, of course, is it gives you extra redundancy. Landing category of the aircraft, hydraulic pressurization gives you bleed as well as electric. So there's a lot of reasons there to consider restarting that engine. All right, and that's why it's available there in the QH. But once you restart that engine, eventually there's going to be no fuel left in that wing because it's all gone out of the leak for whatever caused it, and you're going to have an engine shutdown to deal with. In my book and in my mind, I'd be doing that at a relatively low workload period of time because workload's going to go up again, and brief that with my crew as to my colleague as to when would be an appropriate time to do that. When we think we're less likely to need that redundancy. Good. Okay. So where else can we go from there? So we're clear and we understand that shutting the engine down, if it stops, then it's an engine leak. Keep it off. If it continues, give it, put the transfer on to the other side that's not leaking. Keep the cross bead shut. Consider restarting the engine, and at some point you're going to need to shut that engine down. Okay. If, however, there is no asymmetry in the fuel depletion rate between the two sides, but you're still losing fuel, if there's no asymmetry in the fuel depletion rate between the two sides, left and right, the possible locations of the fuel leak are the center tanks themselves, the trim tank feed line, or the trim tank itself if it's installed, or the APU fuel feed system. Now, if the APU is on, and if there's a smell of fuel in the cabin, the APU must be switched off to prevent the fuel loss through the APU fuel line. Now, the reason you might have the APU running is it might be an MEL item, such as you've lost a generator on one engine, and obviously now turning that off, you're going to lose some more redundancy. But that's an important step if we believe that we are losing fuel. Then the article comes on to the very last part here, you'll be pleased to know, is do not use the reverser thrust at reversers. Get my teeth in. Do not use thrust reversers at landing. I struggled with that when we talked about another event with thrust reversers. I can't say it. Thrust reversers must not be used at landing to avoid blowing the leaking fuel towards the engine air inlet. So we don't want to be sucking fuel into the engine, into the hot parts of the engine, obviously. Not matter so much if it goes down the bypass around the outside, but still, it will still eventually reach the exhaust and the hot parts of the engine, and or it goes into the core of the engine, and forward to the engine air inlet or the hot brakes. Fuel and hot brakes, obviously not a good combination. This could cause the overheat of the engine, reduce performance of the brakes, and most of all, the start of a fire in either the engine and or the hot brakes. Okay. So to conclude then, adherence to operational procedures is crucial to ensure safe management of a fuel leak. As per SOPs, the flight crew should regularly monitor the fuel consumption to detect the potential for a fuel leak as soon as possible. ECAM alerts indicating a possible fuel leak either in the aircraft fuel system or in the engine fuel system are also available as an additional safety net. So they are a belt and braces, extra level of protection, but they are not to be relied upon instead of manual fuel checks. So I'm pretty sure that's consistent through all companies. As soon as a fuel leak is confirmed, the flight crew must consider landing at the nearest suitable airport, land ASAP on the QRH. The flight crew must perform the various steps of the fuel leak procedure to identify the location of the leak and contain it to prevent further fuel spillage. This will ultimately, depending on what the indications you get, ultimately is going to lead to shutting an engine down. And of course, we monitor then the depletion. If it stops, great, it's an engine leak. If it continues, then you can suspect that that's a wing leak. If there's no discrepancy between the fuel themselves, the tanks themselves, but you are still leaking fuel somewhere, then it can be suspected it's either the trim tank, the trim lines, or the APU. Okay, the two cases are very different in terms of engine and I know I've said this before, engine and fuel tank. With a fuel tank leak, you can consider restarting that engine, but it is obviously going to deplete, and it may be that it depletes at such a rate, and depending on how much fuel you've got in that side, that's going to lead to a fuel starvation, and you will at some point either the engine will shut down itself, or you will need to shut it down at an appropriate time. The flight crew must perform the various steps of the fuel leak procedure to identify the location of the leak and contain it to prevent further fuel spillage. If obvious cues enable the flight crew to confirm the engine fuel leak, the procedure requests that they shut down the affected engine immediately to prevent fire and contain the leak. The thrust reverser must not be used at landing to avoid blowing fuel forward toward the engine air intake or towards the brakes to reduce the risk of fire. Well, I think that's a fantastic article, actually. A pretty scary event for any of those that have had fuel leaks. It does happen. I know of cases, and this is just a great way of looking at the fuel systems and the QRH procedure and learning from an actual in-service event. So it's really, really useful. There's a few things in there that have got my attention. And just really a reminder of the importance of carrying out those fuel checks, because ultimately it was the fuel checks that alerted the crew to this before the ECAM alerted them to the possibility of a fuel leak. Obviously they didn't complete it, and for reasons we don't know, they continued to run that engine. Maybe they hadn't diagnosed it correctly. Who knows? I'm not going to surmise. But they didn't, and they kept it running. And we're looking at the risks of keeping an engine running that had an actual engine fuel leak because of that fuel hose that came from the pylon into the engine had become detached, and they were losing 2 tons, I think, an hour, 45 litres per minute. That's a significant amount of fuel. So it's the importance of when you've identified that to be the case, that the engine is shut down and remains shut down. Good. Well, I hope you found that useful. I really enjoy these safety first events. Please go ahead and read it at your leisure. It's quite a chunky article. This one's a bit bigger than normal. There's a lot of good stuff in there. And if you've got any thing you want to feed back, if you've had an in-flight event where you've had a fuel leak, or you have anything which to add some more context to this, if you're operating the 330, please do get in touch. Leave it in the comment section below, and be pleased to hear of your experiences or any knowledge you have to expand on this event, or any more take homes that you've got from this, or from your own experience, any other events, or some techniques that you adopt as an extra level of protection to pick up these potential hazards on your flight, or what your company requires you to do in terms of fuel checks. Would be quite useful. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe, keep the plate spinning. I'll see you on another episode at Airbus What's It Doing Now in the near future. Thanks, and bye for now.